The first thing that struck the morning sky above northern New Guinea was its silence. A silence so clean and absolute it felt engineered, as if the air itself were waiting for something violent to happen. William Bill Dunham skimmed along the upper atmosphere in his P-47 Thunderbolt, the rising sun turning the canopy glass into a hard gold sheet. The Pacific light washed every ridge, river mouth, and distant cloud in blinding clarity, making the entire landscape look deceptively peaceful. But Dunham recognized the signs: the thin shimmer along the horizon, the static in the headset, and the faint vibration in the frame that always meant the air war was shifting. His squadron had lifted from Nadzab in a dispersed escort pattern meant to sweep Japanese movements near WWII. Somewhere along the long climbing arc, Dunham drifted slightly out of alignment. A valley crosswind nudged him off track. A course correction widened the spacing, then radio bursts thinned. By the time his instruments steadied at 16,000 feet, the sky behind him was empty of American aircraft. He was alone, and the morning light made that aloneness feel sharper. The P-47 wasn't built for quiet. Its R-2800 engine roared even at idle, and at cruising climb settings it filled the cockpit with mechanical thunder. But Dunham could still sense the wrongness in the environment. The air density had shifted. The wind shear felt unnatural. High above the northern arc, toward WWII's sprawling network of Japanese airfields, the sky carried a texture that seasoned pilots learned to read like a warning etched in light. Then he saw it. Not a shape, not a wing, just a glint, a hard, needle-like reflection that shouldn't have been there. His eyes adjusted. The glint multiplied. What began as 3 shimmering points became 8, then a dozen, then the faint silhouettes of aircraft emerging from a thin, deceptive haze. They weren't scattered. They weren't disorganized. They were layered, stacked in controlled altitude bands with frightening precision. A Japanese fighter sweep, and not a small one. Dunham steadied his breathing. The enemy formation widened into a predatory crescent. Key 43 Oscars and Key 61 Tonys, the familiar mix of agility and climb performance the Sentai preferred when hunting American aircraft. But this wasn't a hunting pair. This wasn't a small patrol. This was a swarm, dozens moving with the slow, coordinated intent of pilots who understood their numerical advantage. At a glance, an inexperienced pilot might panic at the shape alone, the way the formation curved, tightening like a closing fist. But Dunham didn't panic. He processed everything like a technician reading a complex instrument panel. Spacing, entry angle, sun position, their climb arc, their wing discipline, their preferred diving band. He knew exactly how they would strike. They were setting up a layered descending attack, cycling through altitude and energy to overwhelm him with repeated slashing passes. Against a lone fighter, especially one as heavy as a P-47, it was a nightmare geometry. He checked fuel, ammunition, oil temperature, supercharger response. The Thunderbolt answered with the confidence of a machine built to endure punishment. 8.50 caliber machine guns sat loaded in the wings, enough firepower to saw through light Japanese airframes in seconds. But ammunition wasn't infinite, and Japanese fighters didn't need long bursts. They relied on pressure, on numbers, on exhaustion. Another glint, then movement. The first elements began to peel off toward the sun. Classic. They intended to blind him on the opening strike. Dunham eased his throttle slightly forward. The P-47's nose dipped. The aircraft gathered weight, momentum, purpose. The Thunderbolt didn't dance, didn't turn fight like an Oscar or whip through the air like a Tony. It was a vertical predator, a diving hammer. A machine that killed not through finesse but through unstoppable kinetic authority. It required discipline, especially when alone. The Japanese fighters continued sharpening their angle. Their silhouettes became clear, small, nimble frames catching sunlight off polished wings. Every passing second tightened their descent geometry. They had seen him. They had marked him. They had committed entirely. The Pacific sky transformed from blue expanse to closing arena. Dunham felt the shift in his gut, the moment before combat, when the atmosphere thickens and the noise of the engine becomes the only steady thing in the world. The sun stabbed through the canopy. The Thunderbolt's vibration deepened. The incoming formation stretched into an attacking wave nearly a mile wide. He was outnumbered, outpositioned, cut off from his squadron, and the enemy was already accelerating toward him. But Dunham had been in this war long enough to know that the P-47, when flown with absolute control of altitude and speed, could survive what no lighter fighter could. And as he brought the nose a few degrees down, building the speed he would need for what was coming, he understood the sky had already chosen sides. A lone Thunderbolt, a converging Japanese swarm, no reinforcements, no escape window. The silence before the storm fractured as the first wave broke into coordinated diving spirals, sharp, fast, deadly lines cutting through the sun's glare. The battle was about to begin. The sky above New Guinea did not randomly produce moments like this. Encounters where a single P-47 stood alone against an entire Japanese fighter sweep were born from months of shifting strategy, attrition, and the relentless American push toward air superiority. To understand why Lieutenant William Bill Dunham found himself isolated above WWII that morning, it's necessary to understand the world that shaped the encounter, one defined by geography, unit doctrine, pilot evolution, and the hardening realities of the Pacific Air War. By this stage of the campaign, the skies over northern New Guinea had become one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds on Earth. WWII served as the Japanese Empire's major air hub for the entire region, an armored nest of revetments, fuel stores, and repair facilities carved into jungle clearings. 4 major airfields lay within reach of each other, all built to house fighter units that had once dominated early war engagements, but by now American pressure had begun collapsing those advantages. The 5th Air Force had grown increasingly confident, increasingly aggressive, and increasingly efficient. Every week brought more P-38s, P-39s, P-40s, and now the formidable P-47D Thunderbolts, their massive engines and heavy frames brought to New Guinea specifically to shatter Japanese superiority. Dunham belonged to the 348th Fighter Group, a unit whose arrival marked a shift in American offensive posture. The P-47 was unlike anything the Japanese Fighter Corps had faced. It was fast in a dive, brutally durable, and armed with 8 50-caliber guns, each one capable of tearing apart a lightweight Oscar or Tony in a heartbeat. And critically, the 348th didn't fly the P-47 timidly, they flew it with doctrine. American tactical doctrine emphasized altitude advantage, energy retention, and the decisive violence of boom and zoom attacks. Japanese units, especially those flying the Ki-43 Oscar, were trained primarily around turn radius, climb discipline, and overwhelming numbers. Their aircraft were agile, lightweight, and unforgiving of mistakes. Their pilots were skilled but often forced into outdated tactical structures by their commanders. By 1943-44, the attrition inflicted by the 5th Air Force had hollowed many of their squadrons. Younger pilots entered combat with minimal training, relying on group mass to survive. That created the conditions for large, intimidating swarms that were dangerous in their volume but vulnerable to a single well-executed American energy fight. This was the world Dunham flew in, a sky where experience, speed, and fire discipline became more decisive than maneuver alone. Dunham himself had steadily evolved into one of the 348th's most reliable killers. Calm, methodical, and brutally focused, he had built a reputation not on reckless bravery but on analytical discipline. He knew exactly what his aircraft could do, exactly where its strengths lay, and exactly where death waited for pilots who forgot the Thunderbolt was not a dogfighter. He climbed high. He kept his speed. He made decisions in fractions of seconds that other men needed seconds to think through. But even a pilot like Dunham could be stretched by the geography of New Guinea. The island was a tapestry of jagged ridges, humid valleys, unpredictable thermal layers, and sudden crosswinds that separated formations without warning. Radio interference was constant. Magnetic drift caused navigation errors. Squadrons routinely arrived over target zones, spread out in wide arcs, rather than tight combat boxes. That morning, as the 348th fanned out in search of scattered Japanese flights, the combination of environmental quirks and patrol spacing widened Dunham's gap. The squadron did not deliberately leave him. They simply drifted into a loose screen across a wide expanse of sky, and one thin seam in that screen was enough for him to slip into isolation. Meanwhile, the Japanese side of the battlefield was undergoing changes of its own. WWII's air groups, under constant pressure from American bombing raids, had adopted a more aggressive intercept posture. They launched larger formations not because they wanted overwhelming kills, but because they were defending the last major aerial foothold in northern New Guinea. American attacks had already gutted several Sentai, but the remaining units flew with fierce desperation. They did not intend to lose WWII without inflicting damage. Those larger intercepts were increasingly patterned around layered altitude bands, an attempt to counter the American preference for high-energy attacks. By staggering fighters at 2,000 to 3,000 foot intervals, Japanese commanders hoped to create a multi-layered barrier. Any American fighter diving to attack would have to cut through multiple dangerous zones on the way down. In theory, the formation was designed to negate American boom and zoom advantage. In practice, it created something else, a massive, intimidating, but tactically rigid swarm. And Dunham had flown directly into the upper edge of one of these systems. The Sentai pilots that morning were not expecting a lone American fighter at altitude. Their initial approach was disciplined but cautious, prepared for multiple P-47F. But when Dunham's Thunderbolt remained alone, no wingmen emerging from the haze, no diving pairs forming behind him, their posture shifted. The swarm became predatory. Their layers tightened, their formation curved. Their descent adjusted into aggressive spirals designed to trap him inside his altitude band. This convergence defined the moment, an American pilot perfectly suited for altitude combat, now isolated, and a Japanese formation that depended on numbers and synchronized pressure, now committing everything to a single kill. The world that shaped this confrontation was not random. It was the collision of two strategies, two doctrines, and two forms of aerial philosophy. And the moment Dunham saw that glint in the upper haze, he understood that everything since Nadzab, every escort sweep, every climb drill, every energy management maneuver, had prepared him for this. A lone P-47, a tightening Japanese net, an entire aerial front tilting toward a single point in the sky, and Dunham was already adjusting his altitude band to meet it. The Japanese formation committed first. From above Dunham's altitude band, 3 Ki-43 Oscars broke into downward spirals, tight, predatory arcs meant to collapse onto his position from the sun's glare. Their wings flashed silver as they cut through the light, their descent controlled, disciplined, and perfectly synchronized. High above them, another group shifted subtly outward, widening into a high-altitude bracket meant to seal Dunham's escape route. The swarm wasn't descending all at once. It was layering, shaping the sky into a funnel pointed directly at the lone Thunderbolt. Dunham didn't wait to be trapped. He pushed the throttle to the war emergency stop, letting the R-2800's deep, mechanical roar surge through the cockpit. The P-47's nose dipped just enough to build speed, no more, no less. The Thunderbolt gathered weight instantly. The airframe loading with kinetic drive. Dunham felt the control stick tighten, the surfaces stiffening as the aircraft pushed toward the edge of compressibility. That speed was his one irreplaceable asset. With it, he could break angles Japanese fighters couldn't match. Without it, he would be a drifting target inside a shrinking cage. The first Oscar slashed in from the right. Dunham didn't turn to meet it. He let the Thunderbolt drop, rolling slightly into a shallow diving arc. The Oscar overshot, unable to adjust to the sudden change in vertical geometry. Japanese aircraft thrived on horizontal reaction, not vertical momentum. By the time the Oscar pilot banked hard to reacquire the American fighter, Dunham was already sliding under him. No hesitation, no angle wasted. The second Oscar came in tighter, diving with more precision, the pilot anticipating the P-47's likely path. Dunham barely shifted his control input. He dipped the nose a fraction deeper, letting the Thunderbolt sink into denser air. The Japanese fighter misread the movement, braking too early, then flattening out in the wrong band. That mistake cost him altitude Dunham now controlled. The third Oscar attacked nearly head-on, its pilot gambling on an aggressive closure to force Dunham out of his speed advantage. The maneuver was bold, but the P-47 carried 8.50 caliber guns, each one a sledgehammer. Dunham steadied the nose for less than a heartbeat. No pause, just a cold alignment, then fired. The guns ripped the air apart in a deafening, vibrating burst. Tracers tore across the gap. The Oscar disintegrated in seconds, fragments spiraling away as Dunham sliced past the wreckage, never breaking his dive. But killing one meant nothing. The swarm was adjusting. Below him, another wave of fighters climbed to intercept. Above him, the high-altitude bracket tightened. The sky became a three-dimensional maze, each section shifting, contracting, reacting to the Thunderbolt's movement. The Japanese pilots were not reckless. They were methodical. They were coordinating through visual cues, tightening their net like a living organism. Dunham rolled into a steep right dive. G-forces pressed against his ribs. The overloaded frame shuddered. The altimeter blurred. Behind him, a Key 61 Tony dropped into pursuit, the faster, heavier Japanese design committing to a chase that most Oscars couldn't attempt. The Tony pilot showed discipline, no wasteful turn, no hesitation, just a precise slicing dive aimed at Dunham's tail. Dunham's response was immediate and cold. He extended the dive another 1,000 feet, then pulled sharply upward into a climbing right turn, a maneuver impossible in anything lighter than a Thunderbolt. The P-47 bled speed, but not dangerously. It converted the dive's kinetic load into a rising vertical curve. The Tony tried to follow. It couldn't. The heavier Japanese engine couldn't maintain the climb at that angle. The Tony stalled first, flattening out and losing the vertical race. Dunham inverted. At the peak of the climb, the P-47 hung for half a second, suspended in thin air, then flipped into a punishing diving roll. Gravity seized the Thunderbolt. The aircraft plunged directly toward the Tony that had just stalled beneath him. He leveled the nose, squeezed the trigger once. The .50 caliber burst hit the Tony mid-frame. A flash. A wing sheared away. The fighter spiraled downward, trailing smoke, disappearing into the haze below. 2 kills, but the sky was deteriorating. Another cluster of Japanese fighters closed in, 6, maybe 8, now diving in a coordinated wedge formation. They weren't trying to outmaneuver him. They were trying to corner him, bleed his altitude, contain his speed, and force him into a horizontal fight he could not win alone. The Thunderbolt's power mattered, but Japanese numbers mattered too. The swarm moved in waves, each one setting conditions for the next, each one shrinking the airspace around him. Dunham kept moving. He never offered a still target, never held altitude, never let the swarm dictate the vertical band. He climbed when they flattened, dived when they climbed, rolled when they converged, accelerated when they tightened. He flew the Thunderbolt as a weapon system, not a fighter in a dogfight, but a kinetic projectile controlling the vertical axis of the sky. And the more he moved vertically, the more the swarm stumbled. Their rigid formation struggled to mirror him across shifts in altitude. The Oscar's light frames couldn't hold dives. The Tony's heavier wings struggled in steep climbs. Their coordination began fracturing. Then Dunham saw it, a narrow seam opening between two descending elements. It wasn't an escape. It was an opportunity. He leveled out, banked hard, and accelerated straight into the gap, slicing through the swarm's mid-layer. Before they could collapse the opening, another Oscar drifted into his lane, just a fraction off formation. Dunham fired another burst. The fighter shredded instantly, falling in pieces through the air. 3 down, dozens remaining, and the sky still tightening, but the swarm had lost its discipline. And Dunham knew what came next. He would take the battle to its breaking point. The sky that had once stretched clean and bright now felt carved into jagged, shifting layers, each one distorted by heat, motion, and the violent churn of aerial combat. Dunham had forced the swarm to break formation, but breaking a swarm did not make it disappear. It made it angrier, less predictable, more dangerous. The disciplined descent had collapsed into a chaotic hunting pattern. Fighters no longer moved in perfect arcs. They dove, climbed, and twisted independently, creating a sky filled with intersecting kill paths. And Dunham was in the middle of all of them. His Thunderbolt shuddered as he pulled out of another shallow dive, the G-forces slamming into his chest and locking his breath in short, tight bursts. Sweat blurred his vision. The air smelled of hot oil and cordite from 50 caliber bursts he had already fired. Ammunition was dropping. Fuel was sliding toward the lower registers. The engine temperature needle crept slightly right, still safe, but trending toward the margin every pilot feared. The next wave came fast. 3 Key 61 Tonys dove in from high left, staggered in a stepped pattern meant to force Dunham into a fatal oscillation. If he climbed to evade the first, the second would cut across his path. If he dropped to evade the second, the third would meet him head-on. It was a trap built on geometry, a narrowing corridor of angles converging on his altitude band. Dunham chose the one move they wouldn't expect. He accelerated directly at the lowest Tony. It was a gamble only a P-47 pilot would take. The Thunderbolt's nose dipped slightly, its massive airframe gaining speed like a falling anvil. The Tony pilot flared too early, misjudging the P-47's velocity. Dunham passed under him by a blade's width. At that speed, firing risked jamming the guns, so Dunham didn't shoot. He used the dive instead, driving the P-47 into thicker air until he felt the wings loading properly again. But the second Tony cut down from above, diving almost vertically. Dunham flicked his eyes to the lift vector. Too steep to turn, too close to roll, too much closure for evasion. He snapped the Thunderbolt into a brutal snap roll left. The aircraft bucked sideways. The sudden lateral load slammed his shoulder into the cockpit frame. The world spun in a stuttering blur, sky, earth, canopy glare, and then steadied. The Tony flashed past, missing him by seconds. Dunham felt a tremor in the ailerons. The P-47 had not liked the maneuver, but it was still intact. The third Tony was already repositioning. Dunham climbed. Not for altitude advantage. He didn't have enough space. He climbed to force the Tony into a steeper angle of pursuit, one that would make the Japanese aircraft bleed its energy too fast. The Tony followed, disciplined, committed. At the peak of the climb, the Thunderbolt slowed, hanging for a moment like a weightless shape in a thin current of air. That was the moment Dunham needed. He punched the rudder, rolled inverted, and dove straight past the Tony's nose. The Japanese pilot tried to follow, but the speed differential was catastrophic. The Tony stalled, rolled, and dropped into a spiraling fall. Dunham didn't fire. He didn't need to. The pilot wouldn't recover in time. The victory bought seconds, nothing more. Below, 4 Oscars rose in a loose diamond, climbing aggressively to cut his escape line. Fragmented as the swarm was, their sheer number gave them coverage across every altitude band. Dunham saw instantly what they intended, not a head-on strike, but a containment box. If they boxed him, they would burn him down with repeated passes, until he had no speed left to fight. He refused to let that happen. Dunham pulled into a shallow climbing right turn, enough to bait the lead Oscar into committing to a vertical merge. The moment the Japanese fighter angled up, Dunham chopped throttle slightly, widened the turn, and forced the Oscar to overshoot. The pilot tried correcting. Too fast, too shallow. The Oscar slid into Dunham's firing lane for less than a second. It was enough. A short burst, clean, controlled, 3-round precision. The Oscar snapped apart at the cockpit frame. A wing tumbled away. The remainder fell like burning paper. But Dunham had no time to mark the kill. 2 more Japanese fighters sliced across his tail. Tracers whipped past his canopy. Thin, bright lines of lethal light. 1 round clanged off his left wing root. Another cracked against the armored plate behind him. The Thunderbolt absorbed both hits without noticeable damage. That armor, that weight, that rugged American engineering. It was the only reason he was still alive. He dumped altitude again. The dive was faster and steeper than he liked, but it bought distance. Airspeed surged. The Thunderbolt's frame vibrated, warning of the threshold where compressibility could seize the controls. Dunham held until the air thickened enough to pull out safely. He leveled. The sky had changed. What had begun as a coordinated Japanese sweep was now a scattering of isolated hunters. Their discipline had collapsed. Their numbers were still overwhelming, but their structure was broken. They chased individually, reactively, without sector coverage. Dunham no longer faced a swarm. He faced a storm of single hunters, and in that kind of chaos, the P-47 was at its deadliest. His engine roared as he rolled into a fresh climb. His ammunition was low, but not empty. His fuel was thinning, but not terminal. The horizon shimmered with heat. The air smelled of metal and burning powder. He had survived the worst of the trap. Now came the moment that defined P-47 doctrine. Take the initiative, seize the vertical, finish the fight. The breaking point was behind him. The counter-assault waited ahead. The sky finally began to widen again. The chaos that had consumed the altitude band over WWII thinned into scattered shapes, isolated fighters without formation, without coordination, without the predatory synchronization they had begun with. Dunham had checked the swarm, shattered its cohesion, and forced its remnants into disorganized pursuit. The Japanese pilots, deprived of altitude advantage and group momentum, now faced a Thunderbolt flown with full command of the vertical axis. And in that domain, even outnumbered, the P-47 was the dominant machine. Dunham watched the last pair of fighters break away, one climbing steeply into the haze, the other drifting low toward the coastline, their fuel and energy likely spent. They were no longer attackers. They were survivors. And they had no appetite for another high-speed merge against a P-47 that had already killed multiple aircraft and outmaneuvered the rest. The sky, once a closing cage, now stretched out across the Pacific in open, sunlit tiers. Only then did Dunham ease back on the throttle. The Thunderbolt groaned as it settled into level flight. The engine's roar softened to a deep, steady vibration, still powerful, still confident, still ready. Dunham scanned the instrument panel. Fuel sat low but manageable. Oil temperature hovered just beneath the danger threshold. Ammunition was nearly gone, but not empty. Despite the violence of the engagement, the P-47 had absorbed hits that would have torn lesser fighters apart. The left wing bore a fist-sized dent where a round had struck the root. The tailplane carried a shallow groove, but the controls remained crisp, responsive, alive. The aircraft had done what American engineers had designed it to do, survive the impossible and return home with the pilot inside. Below him, the jungles of northern New Guinea stretched outward in uneven dark green layers. Rivers glinted like thin metal lines. Smoke rose faintly from distant ridgelines where ground forces pressed their slow advance. The Pacific War was a mosaic of land, sea, and air, each one feeding into the other, and the battle Dunham had just fought was part of the wider pressure that was slowly crushing the Japanese foothold on the island. He adjusted his heading toward Nodzab. The return flight was quiet, the kind of silence that presses into the cockpit after adrenaline drains away. Dunham replayed the engagement in his mind, the glint in the upper haze, the descending spirals, the vertical break, the shattered Tony, the burning Oscar, the narrow seams he had sliced through at near compressible speed. There had been no single moment of showmanship, no dramatic gesture, no lucky break. The entire fight had been a test of discipline, energy management, angle control, and the ability to stay ahead of a swarm through nothing but precision, and that was exactly what made it extraordinary. When he reached the outskirts of Nodzab, the familiar lattice of runways unfolded below. Ground crews waved him in. The P-47 descended with the heaviness of a machine returning from real combat, not the tidy movements of patrol flights, but the subtle stiffness in the frame that signals near maximal stress. His wheels touched the strip with a hard, authoritative impact. The moment he cut the engine, the silence returned. Crewmen rushed in. One climbed onto the wing, looked into the cockpit, and froze at the sight of the damage. Another ran a hand along the bullet gouge in the wing root. A third inspected the scar along the tailplane. Their expressions shifted from concern to something else, something quieter, sharper, respect. Dunham climbed down without theatrics, helmet under his arm. He gave a short nod, nothing more, as if he had returned from a routine intercept. But word had already begun to spread across the airfield. Other pilots drifted toward the revetment. Officers followed. Mechanics pointed out the structural impacts, the near misses, the impossible angles the aircraft must have taken. By the time Dunham reached the debriefing tent, the engagement was already gaining shape in the group's collective memory. The report he delivered was typical of his style, controlled, factual, stripped of embellishment. He stated positions, altitudes, headings, angles of attack, visual confirmations, ammunition expenditure. He listed the aircraft he had fired upon, the ones he had destroyed, the ones that fled. He described the Japanese formation structure, their initial discipline, their collapse under vertical pressure, and the intelligence officers listening understood immediately what his words meant. A lone P-47 had confronted an entire Japanese fighter sweep and broken it. Not escaped it. Not survived it. Broken it. The strategic value of such moments rippled far beyond the immediate kill count. WWII's airfields relied on intimidation, on mass intercepts, designed to keep American fighters cautious, conservative, reactive. But if a single Thunderbolt, flown by a disciplined pilot, could withstand a swarm and still inflict heavy losses, then the psychological dynamic tilted sharply. Japanese pilots, already worn by attrition, now faced the prospect that even overwhelming numbers offered no guarantee. For American flyers, the story served a different purpose. It became a reference point, a demonstration of what the P-47 could do when flown with absolute mastery of the vertical fight. It validated doctrine. It reinforced training. It showed that altitude discipline and controlled aggression could invert battles that seemed unwinnable. In the weeks that followed, Dunham's engagement became part of the 348th's internal heritage. Not a boast, not a legend told around campfires. A lesson, a demonstration, a reminder that the Thunderbolt was more than heavy metal and horsepower. It was an aircraft capable of dominating the sky when flown with the right combination of restraint and violence. And as the Pacific campaign advanced, the consequences of that dominance spread outward. WWII's defenses eroded, Japanese air presence thinned, American fighters pushed deeper, farther, faster. The sky that had once belonged to the Empire now tilted decisively toward the United States. Dunham's fight above northern New Guinea did not change the war alone, but it captured the war's direction with perfect clarity. American pilots rising, Japanese air power fading, and a lone P-47 proving that dominance is earned one impossible battle at a time.